It is the year 1880, and London breathes smoke. You wake up even before the sun tries to pierce the gray fog that covers the slate roofs like a dirty blanket. The smell is the first sign that this world is completely different from yours. Burning coal, damp wood, and something you cannot identify right away, but it is something you will soon learn to recognize as the permanent smell of a house that is never really warm. You are inside a Victorian house, not the mansion of novels, with its golden staircases and impeccable butlers. Not yet. You are in the home of an ordinary middle-class London family. It stands on a red brick street that repeats itself identically for blocks and blocks, as if the city had been built by someone who only knew a single design. There are 4 floors, 8 people living here, and only one source of heat for each room. But here is the question that will accompany you from the beginning to the end of this story. What was it really like to live within these walls? Not the romanticized version from movies, not the sepia photograph version where everyone looks dignified and composed. It was the real version, with cold, with smell, with routines that will surprise you. And there were also solutions that will make you think that maybe those people were smarter than anyone ever gave them credit for. Because what you will discover in this narrative is counterintuitive. Victorian life, especially for the urban English middle class, was not just suffering disguised as elegance. It was a system, a complex system, sometimes cruel, sometimes ingenious. It was built on social rules, as rigid as the iron structures that were beginning to redesign the cities around them. And understanding this system completely changes the way you see that era. Let's start with the most basic. The body. You wake up in a room with a temperature close to 0 degrees Celsius in the winter months. The fireplace in the room was extinguished during the night, because keeping the fire lit while sleeping was considered dangerous, and rightly so. The maid is a 17-year-old girl who lives upstairs, in a cubicle the size of a wardrobe. She already woke up at 5:30 in the morning to light the fireplaces in the main rooms before the family wakes up. That is her job, every day, 7 days a week. You don't take a bath this morning, not because you are lazy, but because bathing every day is not the habit of this era. The bathtub, when it exists, is in a separate room, and the water needs to be heated in kettles in the kitchen and carried manually. For a family with moderate income, a full bath happens once or twice a week. In between, you wash yourself with a basin, a jug of cold water, and a cloth, face, neck, hands, the essentials. And here is the first fact that shatters your assumption. The Victorians were not necessarily dirty due to lack of personal hygiene. They were dirty because of the environment. Coal smoke permeated clothes, hair, walls, and lungs. Historical studies on air quality in London at the end of the 19th century show concentrations of particles in the air that today would be considered an environmental emergency. You could wash your face in the morning and be covered in a thin layer of soot by noon, simply by having gone out onto the street. Clothes are your armor in this world. For the middle-class man, the dark suit, the starched high collar, and the bowler hat are not vanity. They are a code, a visual language that tells the world exactly who you are, which stratum you come from, what you do for a living. Showing up without the correct collar was the Victorian equivalent of showing up to an important meeting in pajamas. Clothing communicates respect, position, and moral seriousness, values that society took with an intensity that today seems almost absurd. For women, the situation is even more complex. The corset, which many imagine as a torture instrument imposed by men, had a more ambiguous relationship with the women who wore it. Some detested it. Others considered its support, structure, even comfort. There was no easy choice. Without it, the silhouette was not correct, and the wrong silhouette was a public statement of slovenliness, of lack of care for social appearance. The weight of that judgment was real and constant. But now go down the stairs. The kitchen is in the basement, semi-buried, with a small window that lets in a weak light. The coal stove is roaring, and the cook, distinct from the chambermaid, is preparing breakfast. There is bread, butter, eggs, possibly bacon. For a well-established middle-class family, the morning meal is substantial. For the poor who live 6 blocks away, in tenements where 12 people share 2 rooms without ventilation, breakfast may be just a slice of bread with animal fat. This distance between worlds is dizzying, and it existed literally on the same street. The London of 1880 was a city of violent contrasts, where wealth and misery lived in layers, like the floors of a house. The higher you climbed in the social hierarchy, the further you were from the literal ground, from the dirt, the odor, the struggle. And the lower you were, the closer to all of that. The question remains open. What made life in these houses bearable or even rich in its own way? The answer lies in the walls. The walls of a middle-class Victorian house tell a story that no school history book has ever told you. Look at them carefully. The wallpaper is not superficial decoration. It is a statement of civilization. Dense patterns of leaves, flowers, and arabesques in dark green, burgundy, and gold cover every inch of the living rooms and dining rooms. William Morris, the most influential designer of the time, believed that every object inside a house should be both beautiful and functional. His prints are on the walls of those who can afford them, and cheap reproductions on the walls of those who cannot. But still, they try. Because trying is the word that defines the middle-class Victorian spirit more precisely than any other. Trying to appear, trying to shine, trying to keep up appearances even when money is tight. The front living room, called the parlour, is the most important room in the house and, paradoxically, the least used in daily life. It exists to receive guests, to show off. The best furniture is there. The piano, when the family has one, is there. The fine china, the framed portraits, the objects brought from travels or inherited from relatives are all there, arranged with a calculated precision that tells the visitor, without using words, we are people of good taste. Meanwhile, the family truly lives in the back room, smaller, warmer, with more worn furniture and a completely different atmosphere. It is there that the children do their homework, the mother sews, the father reads the newspaper after dinner, where life happens away from the eyes of those who do not need to see. And here is something that will surprise you. Victorian middle-class children lived in a kind of parallel universe inside the same house. They slept upstairs in the nursery, supervised by the nanny, a figure who, in many cases, spent more hours a day with them than their own parents. The father worked outside, came home for dinner, and the interaction was formal, structured, almost ritualistic. The mother managed the house, supervised the servants, and, depending on the family, barely entered the nursery during the week. That seems cold. And in many aspects it was, but there was a logic behind it that went beyond emotional coldness. Victorian middle-class childhood was, historically, the first period in which children were treated as children and not as small adults. Before the Victorian period, in poorer families and in earlier times, children of 6 or 7 years old already worked. The idea that childhood was a special phase deserving protection, toys, stories, and formal education was, to a large extent, a Victorian invention. Lewis Carroll wrote Alice in Wonderland around this time. Illustrated children's stories exploded. Public parks were created partly so that children had places to play. Dinner is the gravitational center of Victorian domestic life. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the family gathers around the table, and the white tablecloth is impeccable. The cutlery is arranged with surgical precision, and yes, there were rules about which fork to use at which moment. And using them in the wrong order was a social faux pas, as significant as saying something inconvenient out loud. Soup comes first, then meat, then desserts. Conversation follows approved topics: the father's business, the children's school progress, the health of distant relatives. Forbidden topics at the table included heated party politics, specific details about money, intimate illnesses, and any subject that could cause visible discomfort. Emotional restraint was not hypocrisy, or at least not only that, it was a social technology. A way to maintain cohesion in a world that was changing too fast for anyone to fully process. Because 1880 is exactly the moment when modernity is exploding in slow motion around everyone. The telephone was invented only 4 years before, and train lines now connect almost all cities in the country. Factories transformed what was rural into urban in a single generation. People who were born in small villages are raising children in cities of 1 million inhabitants. The speed of this transformation had no historical precedent up to that moment. And the result is a collective anxiety that Victorian rigidity tries, with constant effort, to contain. At night, after the children went to bed, the servants retired to their rooms in the attic. The couple is alone in the back room. The fire is low. The light from the gas lamp, which in the most modern houses has already replaced candles, casts golden shadows on the patterned paper walls. The husband might be reading, the wife embroidering or writing letters. The silence between them is not necessarily empty. It is often the form that this era found for intimacy. But now it is necessary to speak of what history books often omit when they describe the Victorian era with that soft, nostalgic light. Because there is another side to this house, a side that existed behind the same red brick walls, but that most narratives prefer not to illuminate so clearly. The 17-year-old maid, who lit the fireplace at 5:30 in the morning, goes to sleep at 10 at night. She worked 16.5 hours. She has 1 day off per month, maybe 2. She has no health insurance, no retirement, no formal contract. If she becomes seriously ill, she can be dismissed without compensation. If she becomes pregnant, she will certainly be dismissed, regardless of circumstances. She eats in the kitchen, separate from the family. She does not use the main entrance of the house. She has a name, but inside this house, she is called only by her function, the maid. This contrast is not an incidental detail of Victorian life. It is its fundamental structure. The elegance of the front living room exists because there is someone invisible, working tirelessly on the floors below and above. The comfort of the middle-class family is built upon a layer of unrecognized, poorly paid, and socially erased labor. And here is the twist in this story. The Victorian house, with all its apparent order, its beautiful wallpaper, and its ritualized dinners, was also a place of deep, normalized inequality. An inequality so integrated into daily functioning that most people inside it simply did not question it. Just as they did not question the air they breathed, even if that air was full of soot. You are now at the end of an ordinary day, in 1880. The house is quiet. The fire in the back room has turned to embers. Outside, the red brick street is plunged into a darkness that the few gas lamps can barely pierce. There are no cars. There is no television. There is no blue glow of screens lighting windows. The silence of the Victorian night was a real silence, dense and complete, interrupted only by the occasional trot of horses on the damp cobblestone, and the distant whistle of a locomotive reminded everyone that the future was coming, with or without permission. And it is in this silence that you begin to understand something that went unnoticed in the previous hours. Life in that house was not just a sequence of restrictions, absurd rules, and unjust hierarchies, although it was all that too. It was, above all, a system of adaptation, a collective and individual response to a world that offered few resources, much uncertainty, and no formal safety net. Each seemingly arbitrary ritual had a function. Each social rigidity hid a real anxiety. Think about the starched collar. You can see in it a futile vanity, and that is partly true. But also see what it communicates in a world without a digital resume, without an online professional profile, without instant recommendations. Appearance was their permanent business card. In a city where a man could lose his job, reputation, and home in a cascade within weeks, projecting stability and respectability was as much an economic survival strategy as it was social vanity. Think about the ritualized dinners. You can see in them coldness and artificiality. But also see that they were the only guaranteed time of the day when that family was physically together in the same space. In a world without cell phones, without instant messaging, without the ability to check if your loved ones were okay with a tap on the screen, the dinner table at 7 was the emotional anchor point for the entire family. Formality was the outer layer. Connection was the content. Think about the elaborate wallpaper, the objects arranged in the parlor, the piano that no one plays very well, but is there anyway? In an era before affordable photography, before cinema, before any form of cheap passive entertainment, the domestic environment was the only visual narrative a family fully controlled about itself. Decorating the house was telling one's own story. It was saying, we exist, we have taste, we have history, we have value. The middle-class Victorians were, to a large extent, inventing the modern idea of home as an emotional space and not just a functional one. Before them, the house was basically a shelter. With them, the house became an extension of identity, a reflection of who you were and who you aspired to be. This idea, which today seems so obvious that we barely notice it, was built in those cramped living rooms, in those semi-buried kitchens, in those hearths lit before dawn by young and tired hands. But don't romanticize. That is the necessary warning before we end this visit. The adaptive intelligence of the Victorians does not erase the structural cruelty of the system they built. The young maid who woke up at 5:30 was not participating in any sophisticated cultural project. She was surviving within a system that needed her to be invisible to function. The woman who wore the corset every day was not celebrating her Victorian femininity. Often, she simply had no real choice. History is that. It is always that. Overlapping layers of ingenuity and injustice, of beauty and brutality, of people trying to make sense of a world that changes faster than any generation can keep up. 1880 was not a golden age. It was a human era with all that it means. And what does that era have to say to you, who are reading this now somewhere with central heating, with hot water anytime, with instant communication with anyone on the planet? Perhaps that. Every convenience you take for granted was, at some point, an extraordinary achievement. Hot water coming out of a tap is a miracle that took centuries to build. The right of a domestic worker to have a contract, minimum wage, and guaranteed days off was won through real struggle over decades. By people who lived exactly inside those red brick houses and decided that the world could be different. The Victorian house of 1880 has been demolished or transformed now. Many have become offices, divided apartments, shared spaces where young people from 20 different countries work on laptops. William Morris's wallpaper was replaced by white paint and bare walls. The fireplaces have become decorative elements that no one lights. The maid from the attic no longer exists, at least not in that form. But something remains. The human need to transform four walls into a home and to organize space in a way that tells who we are. To create rituals around the table that anchor people to each other in passing time. This has crossed centuries intact, adapted, reinvented, but recognizable. You do this today. They did it in 1880, and someone will do it in 100 years in spaces that none of us can yet imagine. The fog covers the slate roofs, the coal burns low, the city sleeps. The Victorian house, with all its secrets, its rules, its imperfect beauty, and its normalized injustice, it remains standing within the collective memory of everything we have become. If this video made you see the past in a different way, leave your comment down here. What surprised you the most about Victorian life? Tell us. If you liked it, hit the like now. This helps the channel a lot to keep bringing stories like this. And if you are not subscribed yet, subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss the next video. Because next week, we are going into another place that you never imagined would be so fascinating inside. You won't want to be left out. You